I'm going to be reading from the NIV, so the words won't be exactly like they are on the screen. The birth of Jesus from Luke 2, verses 1 to 5. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child.
Has it occurred to you, everyone, yet how 2020 the Christmas story is? I mean, I know it happened, 2020 years ago, but I mean, just listen to this. Mary finds herself in a shocking and disconcerting medical condition, the likes of which no one has ever seen before. Joseph's in such denial about what's even happening that it takes divine intervention for him to even accept that it's real. And then, as if all of that isn't enough, more and more just keeps going wrong for them. Mary, full with child, has to go on a journey to Bethlehem at the end of her third trimester. Let me just stop to say a few things about that. Shanda is not anywhere near the end of her third trimester. Shanda has done this 2 times before. Shanda is a wise and strong woman of 40, not a teenager of maybe around 14. And if Shanda and I were taking a journey this Christmas, I don't think the words either of us would use to describe the experience would be joyful, lovely, peaceful, bursting with hope. We would be talking a lot about bursting, to be sure, but not like that. And keep in mind that our journey would involve padded seats on cars and airplanes, not the backside of a donkey. And fun fact, I once rode a donkey when I was a camp director. Well, actually, I just sat on it because it wouldn't move for me. But let me just confirm for you what you already know, that the seat on a donkey is not what you would call first class. It's not even what you'd call coach. But this, after everything, is what Mary and Joseph get in the midst of an already very hard year for them. And then they arrive at their destination, Mary now about to actually have to push this baby out, and you know the story. No room at the inn. I'm telling you, there is something really 2020 about this 2020-year-old story. And yes, after that baby's born, we go to great pains to depict everything as now warm and comfortable and beautiful. We coo something like, oh, that baby must have been so cozy in that manger, as if Jesus must have just nestled into that straw and gone straight to sleep, no crying he makes. And as if Mary must have just settled back into a bed of her own straw and just pondered blissfully. But seriously, when we imagine it this way, are we, for starters, even remembering what straw actually feels like? You know, of all the churches to buy into that, you'd think our barn-savvy Mennonite ancestors would have ditched the nativity romanticism for us a long time ago. Because at the end of it all, reclining in all that straw, if I'm Mary or Joseph, my pondering has to sound a lot like this. Is this what hope looks like? Is this how God brings hope into the world? Through this straw-covered baby that God couldn't even bother to secure a proper hotel room for? This Advent, as I've told you the story of the Halifax explosion and the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, I wouldn't blame you if, even as you politely nod along, you have a very legitimate and kind of critical question nagging at you. Maybe you're thinking, sure, Peter, people do good things, even wonderful, equalizing, deeply generous things in the first days and weeks after a disaster, but how long does that really last? How much long-term impact can that really have? It's a fair question. And it's a question that reflects why I've saved hope for our 4th Advent this year, rather than doing it first like we do most Advents. Because even though it's sometimes hard to remember that love, joy, and peace can be found in the midst of a disaster, most of us have seen that. We know it can happen, that people can be really kind to each other after a disaster, that kindness can even bring feelings of joy, that all of it can bring at least momentary experiences of peace. But the nagging question is still, can we place any hope in those experiences? Do the love, joy, and peace that emerge in a disaster really change anything? After Jesus was born, it's easy for us to imagine Mary and Joseph feeling love for that baby, joy they hold him, maybe even a little peace. But after all they'd gone through, were they really ready to believe all that stuff about Son of the Most High, Savior of his people, heir to the throne of David forever and ever? After everything they'd just been through, after all the uncertainty and difficulty that still lay ahead, I wouldn't blame them if they were skeptical. Just as I wouldn't blame you if you've been a little skeptical about the hope I've been preaching in my Advent messages too. If we're looking for love, joy, and peace in disasters, we can find them. But do we dare put any long-term hope in our findings? Do those times a neighbor got groceries for us really outweigh the polarization in this country? Do the donations for those displaced by wildfires, as many as there have been, really outweigh our national disregard for migrant workers? Does a new relationship forged during this time of disaster really mean anything if it's already begun to fade or has suddenly fallen apart? 2020 has been a disastrously hard year. Maybe the most persistently disheartening question in it all has been, on top of all the bad that's happened this year, does any of the good even count for much in the long term? Do we really have any reason to hope? Well, let me tell you a little bit about a woman named Dorothy Day and an organization called the Catholic Workers Movement. Now, you may know the names Dorothy Day and Catholic Workers Movement, but in case you don't, well, let me tell you about them. On May Day 1933 in New York City, in the heart of the Great Depression, Day co-founded a penny newspaper called The Catholic Worker that spoke for peace, solidarity with the poor, and systemic social reform. The paper adamantly reminded its readers that each of these was essential to Christian faith. Before long, the newspaper had collected a community of writers who were otherwise employed or had nowhere else to live. In response to their needs and then the needs of so many suffering the effects of the Great Depression, Day and her partner took the huge step of opening up what they called houses of hospitality for anyone who needed a place to live. And what they did grew and grew until by 1939, their template had birthed 23 houses of hospitality, 2 farms, and study groups around the country, all of which not only offered food and lodging, but deep community that flowed out of an egalitarian power structure in each household. You may not hear Day's name as often as you hear Mother Teresa's, but maybe you should. Dorothy Day was behind a movement that brought food, lodging, community, love, and a platform to be heard to a vast number of Americans. So all that to say, Dorothy Day is kind of a big deal. But here's the thing. You wouldn't have known that if you'd seen her during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. She was there. You could have seen her, but she was only 8.5 years old. She would likely have looked like any other child just trying to survive. But you see, Dorothy Day, even at her young age, was watching what was happening around her very closely. She saw the people putting up tents to provide shelter for children who'd lost their homes. She saw people drag their stoves out of their homes to cook lavish meals for strangers on the streets. She saw social divides melt away as people of all backgrounds just served one another. She saw something that planted seeds in her that over the next couple of decades would slowly grow into a beautiful garden. You see, shortly after the earthquake, Day's family then moved to Chicago. It was there that she began to come to terms with what she'd seen in San Francisco and how radical and unusual it was. The poverty and inequality she found in Chicago bothered her deeply. As writer Rebecca Solnit recounts it, Day later said, "I wanted every home to be open to the lame, the halt, and the blind, the way they had been after the San Francisco earthquake. Only then did people really live, really love their brothers. In such love was the abundant life, and I did not have the slightest idea how to find it." Day would spend more and more years working on that, trying to figure out how she could recreate what she had experienced as a young girl in San Francisco. For a long time, Day described what she was looking for simply and accurately as love. But the writer, Rebecca Solnit, also reflects Day still felt like there was something even larger she was looking for. something that sounded a little like prayer, something that offered shelter like a church, something that had an even larger meaning, something grander and more mystical than everyday life or even revolutionary politics could offer. And so it was that Day, who'd grown up entirely unreligious, one day found that she was looking for Jesus. She found it in the mystical body of Christ, as she called it, whereby we are members of one another, as she described it. And it was after finding what she was looking for with Jesus that Day was finally able to take what she had experienced during the San Francisco earthquake and had looked for and worked on for 2.5 decades since and turn it into the Catholic workers movement. But again, if you'd seen little 8.5-year-old Dorothy on the streets of San Francisco in 1906, would you have thought that all was possible? I wouldn't have. But 2020 years ago, there was an even smaller child who was born into another disaster. And that baby invites me, just as he invited Dorothy Day, to keep looking and looking for that possibility. To peer into the dark corners of even 2020 and to ask, where I see love in the midst of this, where I see joy in the midst of this, where I see peace in the midst of this, where might I also be seeing seeds that could someday grow to look something like Dorothy Day and the Catholic workers movement? Where might I see, where might I choose hope? So this morning, to finish our sermon, I'm going to invite someone who I have to admit surprised me a bit when she volunteered to share about what was giving her hope in 2020. Susan Tripp volunteered. And she didn't surprise me because I had any questions about how much wisdom she might have to share. Susan surprised me a bit in wanting to share on this topic because Susan's one of the people who's been particularly honest with us all about how hard COVID could sometimes be. But then maybe that's exactly why I shouldn't have been surprised. Just as Mary and Joseph's acceptance of the difficulties ahead of them allowed them to get to where they needed to go, I suspect that Susan's acceptance that 2020 has been just plain awful, to not mince words about that or paper it over with superficial hope, is exactly the kind of honesty that we all need in order to eventually find true hope. So, Susan, are you ready to finish this message for me, to tell us about what in this dumpster fire of a year has still given you hope?
You invited me to do this when there were 6 pastors watching. I think that's somewhat unfair.
Well, keep in mind, Susan, none of those other pastors volunteered to do this, so.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Well, my apologies. I didn't realize I was going to have many watching me either. You're going to do great, though. I know it.
So, there's a number of parts to what I have to say. So let's start with the first part. What brought me the most hope in this year of tragedy was that 158 million people had hope. 158 million people showed up to vote. That's 158 million people who had honest hope. Hope that their small, little, minuscule voice could come together with other minuscule voices in hope. Now, some people hoped one way, some people hoped the other way, and I know that. But 158 million people had hope. People who had no voice, people who had never voted, young adults who never believed that they could have any power of change, people who were defeated, they showed up with hope. They cared, they were diligent, they stood in line, heat, snow, being dissuaded by other people. They all showed up for hope. Now I want to tell you a small story about the suffragettes. Most of you know who the suffragettes were. They were determined to get the right to vote for women. And they marched and they had signs And they wore white because in a black and white photo, all of the white stood out. So in the pictures, in the photos, in the papers, having white on made them seem larger. But there came a time when they felt that peaceful antics were insufficient, and they engaged in militant action. They caused disruption, they caused civil unrest. They did things that Black Lives Matter have done as well now. They set things on fire, they broke windows, all in order to be heard. 60,000 people rushed the House of Parliament. And probably very little happened. Then, when 60,000 people showed up now, 80 million people voted for a woman to go to the White House. Not serving tea and crumpets, not someone who was married to someone else and got there through marriage. 80 million people voted to have significant change. A woman in the White House. And that going from 60,000 to 80 million, that gave me hope. Now, change, as that says, doesn't come tomorrow. But it is not that I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is visions of hope. People's commitment to be in a circumstance of horrible 2020, to have the vision to go out and vote is the same dedication to some extent of the 60,000 who stormed Parliament. But I must point out that that was 20 million more than have ever done that before. That is a huge vision of hope, but there are small visions of hope. People who showed up for other things and stood strong. Now, I made a collection of photos, which my spouse tells me is horribly depressing. And I will tell you that to some extent, 2020 has in fact been horribly depressing. And as Peter pointed out, I'm one of the people who pointed out how horribly depressing 2020 has been. There are people in the congregation who have suffered things more tragic. There are people in the congregation who have suffered things more hurtful. And I can't say that all of my pain was your pain. But what I chose to do is show you some of my pain and some of my hope. In all of the areas, there are 4 areas that have caused me pain over this year. In all of those areas, at the end of the horridness that I show you, there's hope. At the end of each vignette of the fires, of COVID, of kids in cages, which just broke my heart, and COVID and Black Lives Matter, racism, horrible, racism in our country, I was able to find hope. The people who showed up, the people who had hope, who went to see their families. In COVID, it brought people together. The scientists worked, as they will tell you, day and night, round the clock for a cure and the beginning of the vaccines. Side note, the vaccines are not going to go as fast as people believe they will go, but it is hope. It is hope that we will stop something that has been horrid throughout the world, because these vaccines are traveling around the world. That is hope. The fires were horrid. The raging, active destruction of everything it touched. People's houses, people's dreams. But when you walk through the ruins at the sad, horrible devastation, you see hope. The firefighters, which are just boys who dedicate their lives literally to stopping fires. The churches from Chico, California, Habitat for Humanity, who went out and put together Paradise, California. You'll see that Paradise, although it burned, they've rebuilt. And after the time where people brought water and brought food and they lived in tents, they have pulled their community together, and they will tell you that they are Paradise strong. We look for small visions of hope. Kids in cages, the most horrid thing that I think could possibly have happened. And you will see pictures that honestly are gut-wrenching. You, at the end of that video, will see parents who finally get to hold their children. Yes, the beds are empty. In fact, some of the holding facilities now have been bulldozed to the ground. And in that action, people stood up. People said no. People had hope that they could change that. And they did. And finally, on racism and cruelty, in France, in Mexico, in China, all around the world, people took to the streets and said, I have hope this can change. All of those people had hope that there could be a difference. More people than I ever could have imagined. People who've never held a sign, people who've never been in a march, people who never have done any such a thing, they showed up. And there I saw a very large vision of hope. And by the way, getting back to the beginning, 80 million people voted to have Black female in the White House. 80 million. A lot of people. Which brings me to the song that accompanies my wife says horribly depressing video, but the song is what pulled me to volunteer. And it's a song that I love. When I told my spouse that this was what brought me to do this, she said, I don't think I've ever heard that song in a Mennonite church. And I went, but I am sure that some of you know this song. And it's called When God is a Child. And for me, that song embodies hope. Hope at Christmas. It was the absolute first thing that came to mind when Peter sent out a request. And it says, when God is a child, there's joy in our song. The last shall be first, and the weak shall be strong, and none shall be afraid. And that gives me hope. That is the song that is mine every Christmas. When you look at this video that Phil saved me and helped me put together, it was a little bit larger task than I had thought. If anybody knows the difference between a JPEG and a JFIF, Piffy, whatever it was, 50, a J50, there's a difference. Just so you know. But look at the end of each small vignette. Hope comes in 158 million people. Hope comes in firefighters. Hope comes in doctors. Although there's been horrid things in this 2020, there is hope. Hope in people who have hope and help us, all of us, to see the hope in the world. And with that, Phil.
Hope is a star that shines in the night, leading us on till the morning is bright. When God is a child, there's joy in our song. The last shall be first, and the weak shall be strong, and none shall be is a ribbon that circles the earth, giving a promise of safety and worth. When God is a child, there's joy in our song. The last shall be first, and the weak shall be strong, and none shall be a song that welcomes the dawn, telling the world that the Savior is born. When God is a child, there's joy